Hi guys, we now enter the last section of the second chapter of India that is Bharat by J.S.I. Deepak. The Christian command to convert non-Christians could not have been more explicit, as mentioned in the previous video by the papal bull of 1493. Importantly, the reference to India in the bull was of direct consequence to the European colonization of Bharat as well, we shall see later in chapter 8. While the bull was issued after Columbus's expedition of 1492, as is evident from the bull, Christian injunctions undergirded both the expedition and the subsequent voyages to the New World. According to Sylvia Winter, she is a scholar, as we have mentioned in previous videos. The treatment of pagan polytheistic peoples as idolaters by Columbus was traceable to the Judeo-Christian perception of the world's population being divided into two. 1. Christians who had heard and accepted the new world of the gospel. Not divided into two, I'm sorry. Divided into these three types of people. According to Winter, the treatment of pagan polytheistic peoples as idolaters by Columbus was traceable to the Judeo-Christian perception of the world's population being divided into 1. Christians who had heard and accepted the new word of the gospel. 2. Infidels like the Muslims and Jews who, although they were monotheists, had refused the word. And 3. Those pagan polytheistic principles and peoples who had either ignored or had not yet been preached the word. Word with capital W, meaning the word of God. Winter was of the view that the religious term idolater informed the meaning of secular terms such as Indios or Indians, which led to the religion-induced racial othering of non-Christian idol-worshipping communities encountered by Columbus. The encounter of the Christian European colonizer with non-Christian idol-worshipping societies in turn led to the justification of liberation and civilization being offered for the colonization of a religiously and hence racially inferior people. This ultimately paved the way for institutionalized slavery and an economy based on it. Mignolo too echoed these thoughts in his paper titled Racism as We Understand It Today, in which he charted the Christian OET-driven origins of the European colonizers' obsession with race and ethnicity, OET meaning ontology, epistemology and theology. Building on the works of Quijano and Winter, Nelson Maldonado-Torres suggested that religion as an anthropological category and race as an organizing principle of human identification and social organization were the products of European colonialism, which only expanded with the growth of Western modernity. According to him, both religion and race were constituted together and became two of the most central categories that altered global history at every level. Therefore, the critical theory of religion was highly relevant to understanding the critical theory of race, and both were relevant to understanding the evolution of ethics. In a sense, any understanding of coloniality or modernity was incomplete without applying the twin lenses of religion and race, and the only way to present an alternative foundation for ethics was to adopt a decolonial approach, given the near-complete hegemony of coloniality and modernity on contemporary ideas of ethics. According to Torres, the age of discovery necessitated the broadening of the understanding of European conceptions of religion when the Christian European colonizer came into contact with non-Christian indigenous societies of the New World. Citing the work of Guy Straumasser, an Israeli scholar of religious studies, Torres took the view that the age of discovery prompted a new approach to religion in view of Christianity's encounter with Amerindians, or Native Americans. This is what makes the age of discovery relevant for understanding the emergence of the modern categories of religion and race. According to him, this was a major epistemic revolution in its own right. He also felt that the link between race and religion was better understood by taking into account Christianity's theological conceptions of Judaism, given its attempts to sever itself from its Jewish racial roots as well as its perceptions of Islam. For a more comprehensive understanding of the race-religion interplay, he suggested the inclusion of perceptions of blackness, namely the perceived link between race, color and existence of a soul, and indigeneity as well. On the issue of broadening of conceptions of religion upon Christianity's encounter with indigenous societies, Torres's interpretation of Columbus's encounter with the native peoples of Americas differed from Winter's. He was of the view that since Christianity recognized only three categories, Christians, infidels, and idolaters, Columbus initially struggled to place the natives of the Americas in any of the three, and therefore assumed that they were not people from a wrong or false religion, but were simply without religion. The absence of religion was perceived as absence of a soul in Christian thought, with the soul being a conditioned precedent for a human to establish a connection with the divine. This divide between those with a soul and without, according to Torres, led to race consciousness in the European colonizer, because the colonizer saw the colored native people as non-souls. This converted religion into an anthropological category, because it had become a marker for race. That the European Christian colonizer was white and the native people were black or of color was not lost on the farmer. Therefore, the white Christian became the one with a soul and therefore fully human, while the black native was without a soul and therefore not fully human, or simply non-human. Owing to this crucible of religion, race and color, the soulless non-Christian black natives were subjected to religion-induced dehumanization, which justified and facilitated their treatment as slaves, or at the very least, as those upon whom the light of Christianity, Europeanness and civilization had to be shone. Entire continents and societies were associated with soullessness, requiring either enslavement or conversion, since adopting Christianity was believed to infuse a soul into the dark soulless native. In other words, in the eyes of the Christian European colonizer, he was not merely saving the soul of a non-Christian infidel or idolater, but was breathing soul into a Satan-worshipping subhuman and animal through his Christianizing and civilizing European touch. If this healing touch was resisted, the subhuman had to be put down ruthlessly like a beast. What is important to note is that whether approached from the perspective of winter, where natives were seen as idolaters by Columbus, or from the point of view of Torres, that Columbus considered them soulless, both views emanated from Christian oity, ontology, epistemology, theology, as it existed then and shared a common purpose. Native non-Christian communities had to convert or die. Initially, Native Americans were welcoming of Europeans, as evidenced by the alteration of their creation lore to accommodate the existence of the white man. However, as contact and trade increased between the two groups, the native gradually saw his land being lost to the European to cover the debts incurred in the course of trade. And as the colonizers' greed for native land increased, conversion to Christianity did too. At the very least, serious efforts were invested by Christian European missionaries to map local traditions and deities onto Christianity to reconcile the two and gradually ease the native into the colonizer's religion. Conversion to Christianity was also projected to the native as a way of gaining social respectability, acceptance into the circles of the colonizer, and access to European education being offered by missionaries. This meant that Christianity satisfied the practical needs of the native peoples, needs which were created by the colonizer instead of fulfilling their spiritual needs. In her paper, The Impact of Colonial Contact on the Cultural Heritage of Native American Indian People, Nasima Dalal suggested that evangelical attempts to convert indigenous populations had more than one objective. The first was, of course, to spread the word of the gospel, and the second was to acquire the land of indigenous populations. Some would say it was the other way around, and that religion was used as a means to an end, the end being integration of native peoples into European culture and complete elimination of the native culture. This was achieved through several means, one of which was to massacre vast numbers of the community, and to ensure that the rest of the community fell in line. They were forced onto reservations with minimal resources. In some cases, diseases such as smallpox and the plague were introduced with the knowledge that the indigenous community was not immune to them. There are recorded instances of voluntary conversion by indigenous peoples when the threat of confrontation with the colonizer loomed large. The hope was that such conversions to Christianity would prevent violence and start a dialogue between the communities. Clearly, such conversion was seen as the only alternative to annihilation. Notwithstanding such attempts to make peace with the civilized Christian colonizer, literature tells us that just about 10% of the native population survived European diseases, massacres, displacements, and assimilation, which wiped out most of its bearers of tradition and knowledge. In contemporary discourse, it is sometimes argued that the little that survives of indigenous tradition is proof of the colonizer's accommodative nature. Listen to this. This also happens in India. The very fact that we survived is said to be the badappan of the colonizer. तुमको जिंदा तो रहने दिया. Literature tells us that just about 10% of the native population survived European diseases, massacres, displacement and assimilation, which wiped out most of its bearers of tradition and knowledge. In contemporary discourse, it is sometimes argued that the little that survives of indigenous traditions is proof of the colonizer's accommodative nature. On the contrary, it is proof of the determination of the community to keep its identity alive. The Europeanization and Christianization of native populations was accelerated and cemented by the fact that the colonizer actively wielded both the stick and the carrot. A once thriving and vibrant society, with its own centers of production of culture and knowledge, was physically and culturally exterminated and reduced to a colonized human mass of illiterate peasants, thereby creating the infamous white man's burden. On the other hand, the yawning void so created was filled by offering European culture as the way to climb the social ladder. In other words, the demand for European culture was created and met, created by the same person, met by the same person, by the European colonizer, not just for the present but for all time to come. This the European colonizer passed off as his benevolence, for he was saving the heathen native's soul from the latter's own ignorance, superstition and savagery. Had it not been for archaeological and ethnological studies, it would have been next to impossible to reconstruct native life as it existed in pre-colonial times, or the genocides perpetrated by the colonizer. But for this evidence, European coloniality would have successfully justified and explained the civilizing effect of colonization and convinced us all that its culture, religion, and way of life were globalized through peaceful means. This explains the present Christian character of the Americas and large parts of Africa, which should come as no surprise. Given the complete cultural domination colonized societies in Latin America were subjected to by the European colonizer, it was only human on the part of the dominated to latch on to the closest living culture, including religion, available to them, namely that of the colonizer, which they wore as a badge of honor with the zeal of a new convert. The adoption of the colonizer's culture was clearly not a matter of choice, but a sheer human reaction, and perhaps even a necessity, thanks to the atrocious and inhuman conditions created by the colonizer. It was only a matter of time before the new convert to European culture and religion not only disowned his previous identity, but also spewed venom against it, because he associated his past and heritage with weakness. See how that applies to India. It was only a matter of time before the new convert to European culture and religion not only disowned his previous identity, but also spewed venom against it because he associated his past and heritage with weakness, superstition, and defeatism, thus completing the process of severing ties with his roots. To use a pop culture reference, coloniality was a form of inception, performed on the minds of the colonized, so that colonialism and colonization were no more external to their consciousness, but became internal to it. Importantly, be it the Americas or Africa or Asia, the replacement or dilution of indigenous faith systems by the European colonizer's religion had an adverse bearing on the sacred relationship between indigenous societies and their land, and consequently with nature. This in turn severely affected indigenous ontoepistemology and culture, as shall be seen in the next chapter.